Hi, and welcome to Teaching Tip Tuesday, brought to you by the Center for Inclusive Teaching and Learning at UWSP. When I started graduate school at the University of Michigan, I was really eager to learn all that I could about biology, but I immediately faced a trauma of special magnificence that almost ended my graduate career. I was going through PTSD from a kind of traumatic breakup. I'd been 100% in love with this guy, or with the idea of this guy, and he dumped me just out of the blue, it seemed to me. I was having a really hard time getting over it, and I'd been hoping that the start of the school year would engage me with a new social circle and new exciting activities, and that I would get out of this emotionally tortured post-breakup blues. So I found a cute studio apartment on Catherine Street for the fall. It had a big kitchen, it had a clawfoot bathtub, and it was close to campus. For Ann Arbor standards, it was incredibly cheap. I signed the year-long lease without blinking, even though the security deposit was a little bit daunting, because what better place to live? 2 days after moving in, I discovered that against all odds, in a city with over 110,000 residents and all kinds of student housing opportunities, I had managed to sign a lease in a house that was directly between the house in which the guy who had dumped me was living and the house in which the woman he had dumped me for was living. Right in between them. The last thing I needed in a living situation was to be constantly reminded of having been replaced. And because I was especially lucky, I would run into one, the other, or both of them coming or going at least 4 or 5 times a week. But that security deposit, I couldn't afford to break my lease. So I had to stick it out for the whole year. And I was miserable. Miserable. I was an emotional wreck between the stresses of classes, teaching, and the constant awkward encounters. I just couldn't catch a break to get over my depression. So I'm not ashamed to say that I spent a lot of time in between my bouts of study in that big bathtub, reading trashy escapist romances and drinking tea. And then finally my lease ended and I was able to get myself into other awkward and challenging circumstances. But it was sometime during this horrible, horrible year that I remember getting really, really angry because I could remember the names of the authors and the characters and the plots of all of the novels. And I could even remember specific entertaining passages in great detail. But all of the academic reading that I was doing, that I was trying to use for my education, was nowhere near as accessible to me. I mean, I read it, I understood it while I was reading it, I was very excited by it while I was reading it, and still, I just couldn't dredge up the same depth of memory about it as I could about the cheap escapist trash that I was reading. And I found it weird because it wasn't as though it was more detailed. It was about the same. It was because of this that I learned a really important lesson. That is that stories resonate more deeply than dry, factual information. We are a storytelling species. Stories form the bedrock of our understanding of who we are and what we value. They provide a social context for events and ideas that makes them more memorable. They stimulate our emotions as we try to anticipate the story arc and empathize with the characters and their struggles. The human brain is just predisposed to process information and meaning that is conveyed through story. In this week's teaching tip, I'd like to share some ideas of how we can use this in our teaching to help improve student achievement of learning outcomes. Many instructors are known to interject occasional personal anecdotes into class. These can enliven lectures and make them a little bit more entertaining, providing a break from the constant stream of content for students and instructors. They can also help us build rapport with our students. Personal anecdotes make students see us as actual people with lives, struggles, and foibles, which make us much more approachable and likable. But few of us use storytelling to its full potential. The limited research in this field indicates that using storytelling and narratives as part of teaching, with stories that are intentionally constructed and planned to help students achieve specific learning goals, can increase student engagement, strengthen comprehension, improve retention, improve performance, and improve student satisfaction. These are the things instructors are always trying to do. So, how can we incorporate more storytelling into our teaching? It's important to begin with deliberate choice or crafting of the story you'd like to tell. You can't just tell random stories and anecdotes and expect them to improve student learning. The stories you decide to tell should embody the ideas you're trying to convey. They should directly support student achievement of learning objectives. And they should make use of the elements of good storycraft. You should be cognizant of the theme of the story. The underlying message or main idea that the story conveys should be directly tied to what it is you're trying to use the story to help your students learn. The story's character should be engaging and sympathetic to provide students with somebody they can invest in emotionally. Consider the background of your students as well as their career goals when deciding who should carry your message in the story. Remember, representation matters. Including character development is also important. Your characters should experience changes in their skills, ideas, or perspectives during the course of the story. There should be some central conflict or goal that drives the narrative. This can provide a focal point for learning. And remember the plot or story arc, the sequence of events that make up the story, including the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. For a quick one-off story that serves as an example, you probably don't need these to be elaborate. This is a great place to incorporate or illustrate what it is you want the students to learn. So let's dissect the story I told at the outset of this video. With regard to character, I presented a sympathetic and relatable protagonist for my audience, who are people who have engaged in higher education for some time. Initially, this character is eager and hopeful about their academic journey, but is also dealing with the emotional aftermath of a traumatic breakup. Throughout the story, the protagonist deals with their emotional turmoil, which leads them to learn an important lesson about the power of storytelling and its impact on human cognition and memory. The conflict in this story is of two types. First, there's the internal conflict. The protagonist struggles with the emotional pain of a breakup, which affects their ability to focus on their studies. This internal conflict is exacerbated by the unfortunate living situation that constantly reminds them of their ex, which represents an external conflict. These conflicts are what drives the plot forward. In the plot, there is exposition as the story begins with the protagonist starting graduate school full of enthusiasm for learning biology. In the rising action, the protagonist's excitement builds as they sign a lease and move into a stellar apartment, hoping for a new and fresh start at graduate school, only to find themselves in the unlikely and uncomfortable proximity of an ex-boyfriend. In the climax, the protagonist reaches an emotional low, feeling miserable and overwhelmed by the constant reminders of their breakup and the stress of their academic responsibilities, but they find solace in reading escapist garbage in the bathtub and drinking tea, which helps them to cope with that emotional pain. In the resolution, the year ends with new knowledge. The protagonist has a moment of realization about the power of storytelling and the way that stories resonate more deeply than dry, factual information. Although the story is short, it touches on a couple of important themes. Obviously, the power of storytelling, but also resilience in the face of emotional and academic challenges. And hopefully, because I'm such an excellent storyteller, you all felt empathy for the protagonist and were drawn into your own memories of reading or hearing stories that stuck with you, allowing you to appreciate the power of stories in forming memories. Now, where can you incorporate storytelling in your teaching? First, as examples, reiterating ideas and concepts as they apply to a novel context. Storytelling is a great way to make examples memorable. Stories can also provide a springboard for discussion. You can incorporate stories as part of scenario-based learning activities to make them rich tapestries, not just dry factual reviews. Think of using them as part of case studies, problem-based learning, or role-playing activities. Consider creating a story that spans the length of your course. In this way, you can tie together a lot of different lessons and examples with people that your students become emotionally invested in. For example, in an ecology course, you might highlight the continuing saga of Rebecca, a graduate student in ecology who hails from a working class suburb of Milwaukee, who has to write a proposal to secure funding for her dissertation research. Her adventure might mirror and illustrate the ecological theories and practices as they're covered during the term, or they may deal solely with issues of research and writing. You could generate a similar type of story for a young marketing executive who's trying to launch a new line of products. Hopefully, you get the gist. This is especially interesting to me since the semester long concept allows you to use foreshadowing and harkening back to past events and ideas in your story, which is a form of review. Keep in mind that the whole story must be broken up into lesson-related installments that connect to the learning objectives of the lessons in question. As the term progresses, the challenges faced by characters can become more complex to maintain student engagement. Using stories in your teaching can be a fun and effective way to improve student learning. Check out these resources to get started, or contact CITL for more targeted help. And that's this week's teaching tip, brought to you by the Center for Inclusive Teaching and Learning here at UWSP. Remember, at CITL, we offer support for course design, learning activities, assessment, and pedagogy. Visit our website to schedule a consultation today.